Essentially what I want to talk today a little bit about is provide some background, some of the historical stuff, then get a little bit into sort of one of the reasons why the group was able to come back, because obviously the organization's been around for some time. Discuss a little bit about the foreign fighter issue, talk about the conflict between them and al-Qaeda, talk a little bit about their expansion into some territories outside of Syria and Iraq, and then briefly talk about some other things too, since there's a lot going on. So thanks for coming. So I just want to start off by just clearly highlighting that, while since June, everybody's like, where do these guys come from? How did this happen? Who knew? The Islamic State, while they're calling themselves that now, it's an iteration of the same exact group that's been around since 1999, 2000, when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi created it, after he got this amnesty from the Jordanian president at the time and then left and went to Afghanistan. So in terms of the area we're specifically talking about for the Islamic State, this is sort of like their idealized version of what they control right now in Syria and Iraq. And each thing is a different wilaya or wilayat in their territory in both Syria and Iraq. And as you note, they don't distinguish between the two countries. Of course, and then since they announced that they had the Caliphate, they've created their own wilayat now to show that they truly have broken sort of Sykes-Picot or San Remo, whatever conference you want to cite in the 1919 or 1920. The reality, though, is they don't control that much territory. While they definitely control some major city centers, a lot of the area in that part that was previously shown is primarily a lot of desert. So it's believed that they only control territory with about maybe 1 million to 2 million at most individuals. And then, of course, this is sort of like what their ultimate goal is, to reunify all of the previous lands in Muslim territory, whether it's Spain, which used to be part of one of the caliphates, as well as part of the Balkans, which used to be part of the Ottoman Caliphate. But of course, this is very utopian in some respects. So I just wanted to get into a little bit why we saw a resurgence of this organization after, the last time you really heard about it was that it was defeated by the Sahwa movement, the tribal awakening, as well as the United States' surge at the time. One of the first reasons was the American withdrawal. I mean, it's a reality. Of course, it's not necessarily the main reason, and I'd argue that the U.S. staying there wouldn't have necessarily stopped any of this from getting to where it is today, to be honest, since a lot of it has to do with some of the policies of the Maliki regime before he left power. One of the things, too, is that after the United States left, the Islamic State went back into Mosul region and started doing a lot more criminal enterprise again. You hear a lot about sort of how they finance themselves. And unlike al-Qaeda, which has historically been about getting private donations from individuals, mainly in the Gulf, but elsewhere as well, the Islamic State has become more or less a self-sufficient entity. They've primarily gotten funding through a lot of the criminal enterprise, whether it's kidnap for ransom, whether it's taxation, whether it's trafficking in oil, antiquities, as well as some other things. But I'd say the single most important thing for them, though, was the Syrian war in terms of being able to come back. The organization originally had Jabhat al-Nusra go into Syria on their behalf and build stuff up. As we know, there's been conflict between the two groups more recently. And then in April 2013, the Islamic State officially said that they're in there under the command of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi instead of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who's the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra. This was important for the Islamic State because it provided them with new recruits, weapons, and sources of funding, which allowed them to then pour it back into Iraq, which helped them, push them into some of the areas that they're able to take over, which we saw, last year from January until June, more or less, in terms of things like Fallujah, Ramadi, and of course Mosul. Another important aspect is prison breaks that occurred in the summer of 2013 in July, primarily in Abu Ghraib, but also in Taji. A number of key operatives that had been arrested during the Sahwa movement and the surge were busted out by the Islamic State, and they're back out onto the streets. So you had these battle-hardened individuals, which provided them with key expertise in a lot of different areas, which helped them. And then, the last one is the Sunni Iraqi grievances. after the U.S. withdrawal, there was an alleged agreement between the United States and the Maliki regime that those who were involved in the Sahwa movement would be integrated into the political system, integrated into the security services, integrated into the military. But the reality is that Maliki got more and more paranoid over time and wanted to hold on to power. And part of it was related to not, following through on a lot of these promises. And as a result, we saw, many Sunnis get really upset with what was going on, and I'll get into that in a minute or so in more detail. So to drill down a little bit further, this is sort of a little bit timetable of how we got to where we are in Syria, at least in terms of the onset of the importance of the Islamic State. So as I noted earlier, Jabhat al-Nusra was put into Syria from Iraq by the Islamic State of Iraq in July 2011, even if people didn't realize it at the time. And they're building up cellular networks, bringing in foreign fighters. And then in January 2012, at the end of it, Jabhat al-Nusra officially announced itself as an organization. While the foreign fighter issue really didn't come on the agenda of many policymakers or officials until probably 2013, really, to be honest. At least based off my own research, the earliest sign of a foreign fighter coming into Syria was in August 2011. It was a martyrdom notice of a Kuwaiti individual. And this is like right when the fighting really truly started beginning between the Assad regime and the FSA. One of the things that Jabhat al-Nusra did differently than al-Qaeda in Iraq last decade, which a lot of analysts noted, was that they're able to ingratiate themselves a lot with the local population. They're willing to work with other rebel factions, whereas, as we know, last decade in Iraq, AQI pretty much just killed everybody, and we're obviously seeing the same again now with the Islamic State. But because of this, they're able to gain some level of support and popularity, and when the United States decided to designate them in December 2012, this was like the first sign for me that I knew that the U.S.'s policy was a failure, is because then you saw the next Friday that there are all these rallies called We Are Jabhat al-Nusra, Kulna Jabhat al-Nusra. And this is what I mean, and this is a key sign to me that things were going to just end really badly in Syria. Obviously, things were already bad by then, of course, because of what the Assad regime was doing, but in terms of the potential positive nature of the direction of what was going on. And then, as I noted earlier, April 2013, the Islamic State officially comes in. But a month later, in May 2013, I think is one of the most important events of this war that many people, downplay, in my opinion, is when Hassan Nasrallah came up in a speech and officially, openly saying that they were fighting with the Assad regime. And this is when the Battle of Qusair really started. The reality is Hezbollah had been helping the Assad regime out all the way since the beginning of the war. But this is when they finally publicly admitted it. And this is when we saw a huge, enormous influx of foreign fighters into the conflict after this time. One of the things to note is that in January 2014, as the Islamic State continued to grow inside of Syria, is that they started stealing land, resources, and a lot of fighters from other rebel groups. As a result, in December 2013 and January 2014, we saw an uprising by many of some of the mainstream groups against the Islamic State. And this sort of led to a battle and this whole reconciliation process that was trying to be put out. Jabhat al-Nusra actually decided to side with the mainstream rebels on this instead of the Islamic State. And this sort of led to the beginning of the true fallout between Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State. Because between April 2013 and February 2014, while they disagreed, it was sort of like, all right, this is a competition now. Who can kill more Assad guys? Who can kill all these other bad guys? But they weren't fighting each other. But then in February 2014, al-Qaeda's General Command put out a statement saying that they're disaffiliating themselves with the Islamic State. And this is when the bloodshed started happening between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. All right, so in terms of the Iraq stuff, I mentioned the withdrawal. One of the things that the Islamic State started to do after they building up capacities again was starting to push new military campaigns. So in July 2012, they started the Breaking the Walls campaign, which is essentially targeting a number of Iraqi security services, assassinating them, as well as targeting a bunch of the individuals that were involved in the Sahwa movement, the tribal leaders. December 2012 was when the Sunni protest movement started, mainly in Ramadi, but it was in some other areas. And from there until around December 2013, we saw protests every week by Sunnis, asking for more rights, trying to, get a piece of the action. And of course, the Islamic State was trying to piggyback off of it, even though they didn't really necessarily care about these people in the first place. Then, we had the jailbreak, and they started a new campaign called Soldiers' Harvest. This, again, was just a continuation of the operations, but the conclusion of Soldiers' Harvest was when they announced the Caliphate in June last year now, I guess. The turning point in what was going on in Iraq was when the Maliki government decided to destroy the Ramadi protest camp in December 2013. This was when many Sunnis realized that they couldn't get, some of their grievances addressed just through protesting or trying to do it through a non-peaceful manner. And this is when you really started to see the Sunni insurgency pick back up in Iraq again. While there still was fighting going on, no doubt, between the U.S. withdrawal in December 2013, the levels of violence remained more or less the same. It was about 200 to 300 deaths per month. And if you recall, during the height of the Iraq War, it was in the thousands a month. And then because of this, you saw there was sort of a coalition between ISIS, the Naqshbandis, essentially a bunch of ex-Baathists, some other Islamists, taking Ramadi and Fallujah in February. And then, of course, the event that really changed everything in terms of how people have been perceiving what's going on was the events in June when Mosul was taken and the Iraqi army sort of just withdrew. I'm not going to get into it too much here, just because I think there's been a lot in the media and written about this, but I think it's important to note that there is a difference between what the Islamic State is doing now compared with how they're operating last decade when they're just calling themselves al-Qaeda in Iraq or al-Qaeda in the land of two rivers. Back then, they only did, when they were in charge of Anbar province, it was just pure, justice. So you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, and if you do, we're going to cut off your head, we're going to cut off your hand, we're going to summarily execute you, and all the other fun things we've heard they like to do. But over the past year or two, they have been, starting to do some level of social services and governance. I'll get into this later in terms of, my idea of where they stand in terms of it now. But I will say that when they started, the organization starting to build itself back up in 2013 especially, is they were genuinely providing services, though it's gotten a little different more recently. So now one of the more fun topics that everybody likes talking about is foreign fighter issue. So this isn't a new phenomenon in terms of people going abroad and fighting in the Muslim world in these types of conflicts. The first contemporary case of this was Afghanistan, when about 5,000 people or so went there. One of the important things to note about Afghanistan, though, is that many of these people that went there actually never fought. They were just hanging out in Peshawar in the milieu, being all cool and stuff. Some of them maybe went over the border, picked up a Kalashnikov, took a picture of themselves, and then went back home in Riyadh and were like, yo, what's up, man? I did this in Afghanistan, no way. This is like a really cool spring break. But the people that are going to Syria now is like straight up like hardcore dudes. So there is a difference in that respect. And as you see with the numbers, the number of people who have gone to Syria is just completely unprecedented. And it's obviously continuing. I mean, if you look at statements more recently from officials, they're still saying that the flow of individuals hasn't really receded at all. It's more or less maintained the same. It's not going up, but it's more or less remaining the same. And the thing, too, is that, at least based on my own research, I've been able to identify up to at least 90 different nationalities represented amongst the foreign fighters on the Sunni side. Of course, there are foreign fighters on the Shia side, which I admittedly believe doesn't get enough coverage, but I don't do research on that. In terms of these guys, I've actually been able to count up to 5,000 Sunni foreign fighters who have been killed. So when you hear all these scary numbers about 15,000 people, being in Syria and in the Islamic State about to all blow up in our sidewalks, this number is the number of people who have gone from 2011 until now. It's not how many people are there now. We can't do a census. We're not going door to door being like, hey, are you Syrian? Are you Iraqi? No. the people have died. Some people have returned home and are just doing whatever. They're done with it. Some people have been arrested. And then, there's some individuals, too, who have gone home and are just waiting for the potential opportunity to do an actual attack. It's a reality. And then the biggest regional draw is from the Arab world. The top 3 countries are Tunisia, Libya, and Saudi Arabia. And then the second biggest regional bloc is from Western Europe. And from there, we see France, Belgium, Netherlands, and the UK leading the count of people going from those places. And just to sort of visualize this, to show, this is a little dated, so there's probably should be like maybe 2 or 3 more dots of different countries by now. But this just shows you how many different places people are coming from. I mean, even people from the Caribbean, South America, as far afield as New Zealand. I haven't seen anybody from Greenland yet, but maybe we'll get somebody soon. Just for example, there's a video that came out by the Islamic State only, last week from some guy from Moldova. I mean, it's incredible in my opinion. So while people have been going to Syria, because most of the foreign fighters are still based in Syria, though there are some in Iraq too, but most of them are based in Syria. They have been going since 2011. There have been 3 main spikes really in terms of when these people really are starting to go. So the first one was when Jabhat al-Nusra first announced itself in January 2012. Because for jihadists, this is when they realized that there was the so-called clear banner that they could fight under, because they didn't believe, that the Free Syrian Army was necessarily a legitimate organization to follow, because they didn't view them as sufficiently Islamic, or a group that would be instituting Sharia based off of their particular interpretations of it. So this was a great opportunity for people that truly believed in sort of the jihadi way to finally enter into the conflict. Then, as I alluded to earlier, May 2013, I'd argue is probably the biggest spike, is when Hezbollah officially announced itself fighting inside of Syria. And what we saw after this was that a number of top sheikhs, including Yusuf al-Qaradawi, essentially saying that fighting in Syria against, the Rawafid and Nusayris, the derogatory terms they use for Shia and the Alawites, was fard al-ain, or an individual duty. This is monumental in many respects. We didn't see this in Afghanistan in the 80s. We didn't see this in any of the other conflicts in the 90s, or even Afghanistan or Iraq last decade. So this, this is some serious business about what was going on in Syria. And the thing to remember too is that this sort of created, the bulk of some of the people that would then go in on behalf of the Islamic State, because this is when you saw a ton of Saudis going in, and the Saudis really make a bulk of a lot of the fighters in the Islamic State, besides obviously the Syrians and Iraqis. And then, more recently, I'd say the third spike has been since the Islamic State announced itself as a so-called Caliphate in June. So what are the reasons for all these people going? I mean, they're not just going for funsies. I mean, maybe some are, but there are particular explanations for it. There isn't one particular one, but you can have a whole host of them. And the thing too is this has sort of changed over time as the conflict has evolved. So one of the main reasons, honestly, is just purely the ease of travel. It's very easy to go to Istanbul or Ankara and then go down to the border with Syria. Going to Afghanistan, going to Yemen, going to Somalia, going to Mali, that's no easy trip. And if you have a plane ticket to one of those countries or a country right next to it to get into, it's going to tip somebody off, I think. So it's very easy, and there are millions of people that come into Turkey every year for just regular tourism. So, and this is also one of the reasons why many Western European individuals have been going as well, is because flights are extremely cheap to Turkey. You get Ryanair, EasyJet, it's like $50. Some people are just driving straight across the border. If you're European, you don't need a visa. You have visa waivers, so it's really easy stuff. Another thing to remember is sort of the legacy of the facilitation and logistics networks. So last decade, during the Iraq War, Syria was what people view Turkey as now in terms of the logistics and facilitation network hub for foreign fighters going into Iraq last decade. And as a result, the Islamic State already had a network of individuals inside of Syria going back a decade. Additionally, what we saw in Europe over the last 5 to 10 years we saw a growth in sort of these grassroots social movements inside of different countries. The main one was al-Muhajirun in Britain. And the leader there, Anjan Chadori, he helped sort of push this in other European countries. So you got Force Annalisa in France, Milatu Ibrahim in Germany, Khalidat al-Islam in Denmark, Sharia for Belgium, Sharia for Holland, and a whole host of these. And sort of you had this group of people that you can easily pluck and recruit from there, and it's sort of like the direct conclusion of it in many respects. Obviously, the issue of social media has been beaten to death by the media, so I don't need to get into it too much. But the reality is that previously, jihadis operated in password-protected forums. You had to know somebody to get vouched to get into the forum. And in the first place, you had to actually know where the forum was. Whereas now, it's just a lot easier to find this content and get in contact with these individuals. I mean, while Twitter and Facebook are doing this for a good reason in terms of connecting people, they have algorithms which suggest people for you to follow based off of your interests. So if you start following like one or two jihadists, within an hour you'll know all the key players. So it's very, very easy to get involved in the milieu. Fourth, I'd say is probably the original reason why we saw some of the foreign fighters go in, was just purely emotional resonance of what was going on in Syria. I mean, you had the Assad regime and Alawi regime out there massacring and slaughtering a bunch of Sunni Muslim men and women, and the videos and pictures that came out evoked a lot of emotions in many individuals, and they just felt helpless and they wanted to do something about it. This obviously has shifted a lot over the last few years as things have changed, but I do think that the yearning still remains a part of it in some respects. Then there's this so-called thing called the five-star jihad. This was sort of a marketing tool used by a bunch of British foreign fighters to try and attract individuals to come over to Syria. So essentially, what they're saying is, look, Syria is not too bad. This isn't Afghanistan. You're not in the mountains living, day to day going through mountains. This isn't, Mali. You're not trudging through a bunch of desert. Syria is a relatively developed country. I mean, maybe not now after the war, but up until maybe a year or so ago, wasn't too bad still. And the thing is that these foreign fighters were living in these nice villas that the jihadists took over from families as well as the Assad regime. So they had video game rooms in them. They had swimming pools that they can hang out in when they weren't fighting or whatever they're doing. And the thing too is that they have easy access to internet too, because they all use SIM cards from Turkey because the border's so close. So compared to past cases of jihads, this is like a good time. I mean, Afghanistan is probably just a one-star jihad comparatively, I guess. I don't know. And then, you obviously have religious stuff going on too. I mean, historically, the Umayyad Caliphate, the seat of it was in Damascus, so there was some resonance related to this. Additionally, there are some people that believe in some of these millenarian ideas, and a lot of the end times prophecies related to Islam, they all happen in, Asham or Greater Syria. There's a reason why Jabhat al-Nusra's media outlet's called Al-Manara al-Bayda, which means the white minaret, and it's in reference to the great mosque in Damascus where Jesus is supposed to descend during the end times and then fighting the Dajjal, who's the false messiah, which leads to eventually the day of judgment and everybody goes to paradise. But some of the people believe that they're seeing some of the signs of the end times, and that's why they felt that they needed to go. But I wouldn't say it's the most important thing, but it is something important to highlight in the back of your mind just to see sort of the mindset of some of these individuals. Then there's obviously the anti-Shia aspect, which I already talked about a little bit, related to Hezbollah in Iran. And then the most important thing more recently is the so-called Caliphate Project, which is extremely important, and it's why we've seen a number of people going to Syria still, even after all of these airstrikes have been going on. So just to show you this quote from Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, I believe this was the one when he had this speech in the mosque in Mosul when he first showed himself for the first time, and only time, I guess, since we haven't seen him since. He's essentially talking about how, we need people here to help us build this state. This is a state-building project. In the past, we primarily saw people, when they're asking for foreign fighters, to go there, just people that literally were fighting. But now they need administrators, they need engineers, they need doctors, they need a whole host of people because they're trying to govern this territory. This is what their game is. So it's important to note that shift because that expands the pool of potential individuals that can be recruited into this organization now. So somebody who might be apprehensive about going to Syria or Iraq because they don't want to fight or just don't feel like they have the skills might want to go now. They can help out in media, they can help out in some of the Dawah activities, they can help out with teaching children, and a whole host of other things. One of the important things too is this provides some people an identity, especially many confused Muslims in some of the Western countries, because they might not feel totally British, but they also don't feel completely Pakistani either. So this identity of being a Muslim and being under the Caliphate provides them a strong identity that they can use and who they are. Another thing is that it does create some level of empowerment. They have some level of agency. They're doing something for themselves. In the Arab world, you have high levels of unemployment. You can go to the Islamic State and you can work. It's a reality. There are cases of people who are doing that. When I was in Tunisia, I actually met this guy who fought in Syria, and he went over there primarily because he was able to get some money to help out his parents. Additionally, you can get married in the Islamic State. This is pretty exciting for some of these young guys, especially in the Arab world where they have to usually wait until they're 40 now since they don't have enough money. So they can go when they're 19 and get a nice looking bride, especially these Western European women who are going there for whatever reasons. And then, they're trying to, put forward this narrative that, this is the land of opportunity. This is the jihadi dream. They're stealing, obviously, the line from the United States. But in some ways, for some individuals, this is an attractive idea. And then lastly, I think some of them believe that they're regaining some level of dignity. They feel that after 200 years of sort of Western imperialism, colonialism, propping up, these really corrupt and authoritarian Arab regimes, that they're finally free. They're able to do things on their own. They don't need to be reliant on anybody else. And the important thing about this, though, is about the Caliphate Project, is that this distinguishes themselves from al-Qaeda in many respects and goes back, I think, in terms of informing us about, what could be the possibilities related to the foreign fighter issue, especially when some of them do return home. So al-Qaeda's raison d'etre and sort of priorities always has been to attack the West. This was sort of this proxy way about getting the fall of the local Arab regimes, because they always felt that you had to get the head of the snake, which was the United States or the West. Because then, once you did, none of these Arab regimes would have money, and they wouldn't be able to maintain power, and therefore they would be able to do a coup. I'm not here to determine whether that's realistic or not, but that's how they sort of looked at the issue. For the Islamic State, their main thing is the state building. You hear a lot of reports in the media about, they have all these Western Europeans, so therefore it could be a lot more potential attacks. Don't get me wrong, I do believe that there is a threat there, but it is important to highlight that many of these people that are going there, they don't want to come home. They believe that this is their home now. People are bringing their girlfriends, wives, children. There's one video from the Islamic State where you had this whole clan of Kazakhs. There's like 80 people in it, and just all these little kids that they brought over from Kazakhstan. So it shows that many of these individuals are just not going home. They're staying there. So I think it's important to contextualize related to some of the debates currently going on about the foreign fighter issue. Additionally, I think it's important to highlight some of the sort of key issues between al-Qaeda and the Islamic State beyond just this difference in terms of first priorities. So there have always been some tensions between these two organizations, even going back earlier than 2005 when Zarqawi went to Afghanistan and bin Laden didn't want him to have a training camp there. And Saif al-Adil, who at the time was the military leader of al-Qaeda, pretty much said, no, let him stay here, because bin Laden looked down on him. He thought he was a thug. He thought he focused too much on the local jihad. He thought he focused too much on fighting the Shia. He just thought he was this low-class, uneducated fool, essentially. And this sort of carried over, and I think you could see the DNA in these organizations because of sort of how bin Laden and Zarqawi's worldview and how they grew up. Because bin Laden obviously was highly educated and things like that. But first, kinks in this we really saw was when Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of al-Qaeda, and Atiyatullah Abdurrahman al-Libi, who at the time was one of the top ideologues, he has since been killed in a drone strike in 2011, sent a message to Zarqawi pretty much being like, stop killing civilians, stop killing Shia, stop bombing churches, stop doing this, fight the Americans, because they're essentially killing just Iraqis. And there are issues here, but Zarqawi's death pretty much brushed this under the rug for some time, but we really saw this coming back up in 2013 over issues related to what was going on in Syria. Because the Islamic State has believed that once they control territory, they're the sovereign power. So what does that mean? That means that once that happens, everybody inside of that territory needs to pledge bay'ah, or a religiously binding oath of allegiance, to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the caliph according to them. And all groups need to dissolve and just come under the Islamic State. And therefore, they're pretty much just pushing their will onto everybody else. Whereas Jabhat al-Nusra, as I noted earlier, primarily was trying to curry support amongst the local population. They're working with other rebel factions. So they sort of had these different visions about how to take territory and then how to govern it. Because Jabhat al-Nusra is primarily involved in these joint Sharia boards in parts of northern Syria as well as southern Syria. Though some things have changed in the last couple of months, but we're not talking about Jabhat al-Nusra. And then, of course, the final straw was February 2014 when al-Qaeda said, enough is enough, you're kicked out of the organization, and that's when the overall fighting started. So one of the things to note about this is that while there definitely are ideological differences, some of this is in part due to generational differences, and that the generational turnover, al-Qaeda was not able to keep the new generation, essentially. Part of this is as a result of all the individuals that went to Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s. They all went to al-Qaeda training camps. Last decade, all of the people looking to go to jihad went to Iraq. Those are al-Qaeda in Iraq camps. So people had more loyalty with al-Qaeda in Iraq, Islamic State, ISIS, what have you. And as a result, you sort of had this generational shift in terms of where the center of gravity was within the global jihadi world. Then, I discussed a little bit about the differences in methodologies. And then in some ways, there's also an issue of jihad of the elite versus jihad of the masses. Al-Qaeda has always viewed itself as sort of this vanguard organization, where they'd be able to, at some point, do a coup d'etat and take over power, and then therefore implement their state. Whereas the Islamic State, they don't have as many issues with taking in just anybody. They do take in anybody. Whereas Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra and groups like them, you need to have certain assurances and commanders in the group to say that you're a legitimate individual just to get into the organization, which is one of the reasons why the groups remain smaller. Whereas the Islamic State is able to bring in new individuals all the time because they don't sort of have these tests. So there's differences in that regard too. And then also there have been some signs that there are some differences socioeconomically between some of the people more in al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, whereas those in al-Qaeda are a bit more educated, better off economically than those in the Islamic State. Though, of course, with all these things, they're not mutually exclusive and there is overlap, but these are some general patterns we have been seeing. And as a result of this fight, we've sort of seen this fight over who is aligned with whom. And I have this really small graph, so you're not going to be able to see it. But it's essentially a breakdown of what's going on in terms of AQ's network, the Islamic State, those who are independent, and some of the key ulama figures within the jihadi world. To drill down a little bit further, because one of the things we've seen in the last couple of months is that the Islamic State, beyond just getting pledges of bay'ah from some people and some groups, has announced that it's sort of annexing territory and other territories outside of Syria and in Iraq. So on November 14th, he put out this statement. This is when they announced the new wilayat. This was in Algeria, Libya, Sinai, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. It's important to note that in Algeria, the group that was now part of this wilaya, Jund al-Khilafa, they're the ones who were involved in the beheading of the French individual a couple of months ago. But since then, they really haven't done much of anything. And primarily, or actually the Algerians killed the leader of the group. So they've had a difficult time trying to get any, sort of swag back. Whereas in Libya, I'd say that's the biggest potential opportunity for the Islamic State to actually have a sort of legitimate foothold in what's going on. And within Libya, they have 3 different wilayat. They've got Barca, Fezzan, and Trablus. And these are sort of like old, similar things to in the past in Libya, but now they're reviving it in some respects. The strongest part of this is in Darna, where this group, Majlis Shura Shabab al-Islam, essentially pledged bayat to them. And since then, they've been able to grow out of Darna, and now they're involved in some of the fighting in Benghazi, and they're even operating inside of Tripoli now as well, and to a lesser extent in Sirte. But their strongest hold is in Darna, where they control part of the city. They don't control the entire city, though, which is important to note. You also have the Abu Salim brigades there, who are essentially a bunch of ex-LIFG guys, Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. These guys were like the Libyan jihadis back in the 90s when they fought the Gaddafi regime. But they're not really within the global jihadi milieu anymore. It's complicated. It's essentially like Gamal Islamiyya in Egypt. They're still pretty radical, but they're not radical. I know that doesn't make any sense. But essentially, in Libya, they are, providing services, doing a lot of the, Hizbah stuff in terms of executing people and caning people and things like that. One area that I'm looking at right now in terms of potential growth is in northern Sinai. One of the interesting things is that up until now, the group operating in northern Sinai that's now part of the Wilayat Sinai is Jamaat Ansar Beit al-Maqdis. Primarily what I saw over the last couple of months was that they're just doing the same exact stuff they had been doing. They're doing bomb attacks against the Egyptian military and security. They're executing people. But it was more or less the same stuff going on. You didn't start seeing them trying to do some type of social program or implementing the hudud or anything like that. But one of the interesting things is last week we saw them for the first time finding some drug dealers in the Sinai and burning the marijuana, which is something that jihadis like doing. And then just yesterday, I believe, we saw them handing out a bunch of money to individuals who had been displaced from what the Egyptian military is doing in Rafah. So they're trying to take advantage of the situation. The question is, can they translate this into actually controlling any territory or being able to, provide services? Obviously, the situation in Egypt's a lot more difficult than in Libya or in Syria or Iraq, just because the Egyptian military is there. It's a lot more difficult. And, of course, you've got Israel on the other side of the border who randomly does drone strikes as well. And then, the other two in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, there really isn't much going on there. I mean, it's just essentially a bunch of supporters pledging bay'ah. We saw, unfortunately, though, that some of the supporters killed some Danish guy in a drive-by shooting on the highway in Saudi Arabia about a month or so ago. And then in Yemen, we really haven't seen any signs at all of ISIS guys talking, really. Part of this is just the strength of AQAP there. So, there's still a lot of wait and see in terms of seeing how this manifests more outside of, the main base inside of Syria and in Iraq. But I will say that the areas to look most closely is most definitely Libya, which I think will more and more become a part of the news cycle again soon, and then also potentially in the Sinai. Moving back to, what's going on in Syria and Iraq, I just wanted to point out some of what's going on. You hear a lot in the news that the military operations and the airstrikes are like super successful and that everything's going well and that, there's going to be Thomas Jefferson riding up on his horse in Baghdad and everything's going to be fine. The reality is that the Islamic State's actually gained more territory since the airstrike started. So the gray stuff is the areas where the Islamic State controls. As I noted before, a lot of it's desert, but still, you can get an idea of it. So it shows that while, it's not like they're taking large swaths of territory and the momentum has slowed down, the reality is a lot more complicated, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to eject than just doing airstrikes unless, some actors involved are willing to break a lot of human rights violations like we did in World War II, though I don't think that that's necessarily out on the table. But I do think it's important to note this in that, you shouldn't necessarily listen to the spin of what the Obama administration is saying about this. Another important thing is looking into sort of how the Islamic State is actually governing. The reality is that when they were just, starting to grow and doing social services, they were fine with it, but they're really having a difficult time governing. It might look a lot better just based off of the propaganda they're putting out, but the reality is that you've had a number of reports from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, about garbage piling up, people not getting services, people, getting screwed over with all the taxes, the economy's going to a halt, rolling blackouts, obviously, all the sex slavery and torture and a whole host of other terrible things that they've been doing. And in many respects, it reminds me of the scene in The Interview. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie, but in the beginning, James Franco, he passes, when they're in North Korea for the first time, this supermarket that looks like everything's great, and he comments how, no way, this looks like the Whole Foods just down my block. But then, later in the movie, after Kim Jong-un says some crazy stuff, he walks past it and then goes inside and realizes it's all cardboard and fake. In many respects, some of the stuff coming out of the Islamic State now is, while it's not that level of fake, they are trying to put a good shine on what's going on, even though things are a bit more complicated. And these are some of the things, they'll show pictures of fully stocked markets, kids going to Ferris wheels and stuff, guys having a great time launching snowballs. I mean, there's been a whole host of snowball fights in the Islamic State in the last 3 or 4 days. It's incredible. It's the most snow fights I've seen in a while. That's what's going on now. It's and that one of the problems is because of the difficulties in getting access into the territory, and people being feared of what would happen if they put out information, is that it is difficult to get good information about what's really going on. Of course, some people are putting information out, but we need to be careful in taking everything that they're saying seriously in terms of what kind of media they're putting out there. I would say that previously they're pretty accurate. They weren't really deceptive and lying about what they're putting out, but I'd say more and more recently in the last couple of months they have, as things have gotten more difficult. But the thing again is that they do still control this territory, and there really aren't that many great alternatives at this point, since most of the other actors have been completely defanged because they've taken all their weapons or tried to kill them. And then I'll just sort of conclude, which probably brings us more to some of the things that we've been worrying about in the news the last couple of days, is related to terrorist attacks inside of the West. So this is a statement from Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who's the official spokesperson from the Islamic State, in September 21st or 22nd this year. This is the first time that the Islamic State called for their supporters to do attacks in the West and outside of the key area. And since then, we've seen a number of plots inspired by the Islamic State, whether it's in Belgium, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in Australia. Obviously, we're still trying to figure out what's going on in France, since one of the guys, Koulibaly, said that he was with ISIS, whereas the Kouachi brothers said that they were with AQAP. So there's a lot of confusion. My own read on it is just the fact that the brothers and one guy, they have known each other going back a decade, and their friendship sort of was able to overcome some of the fitna or discord between al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that them claiming a particular affiliation doesn't necessarily mean anything, and that there's not some Megatron jihadi plot now. So yeah, in terms of that. But it is something worthwhile to look at now, because I do think that we will be seeing more and more potential plots and attacks coming in 2015, in part because al-Qaeda and the Islamic State want to outbid each other to show that they are legitimate, that they can still remain on the top. So yeah, that's pretty much the Islamic State in a nutshell in less than an hour. Thank you.